Good evening and welcome for a little over 1 hour of debate in this 10th session of the Rencontre économique in Aix-en-Provence. But here we're not quite in Aix. We've revisited geography. And so a little over 1 hour discussion around the theme Alleviating Social Anger. And what do we mean by social anger exactly? And so we'll be speaking about this around the table. We have Member of Parliament, Clémentine AUTAIN. Good evening, Clémentine. We also have Camille, who is an economist and professor, specialist in public economy, who worked on inequalities in particular, and who is an associate member of the Cercle des économistes. Good evening, Camille. With us, we have Moussa, CAMARA, who is an entrepreneur and the founder of the association Les Déterminés. Good evening. And with us, thanks to the magic of technology, we have Jean-Viard, who has remained in the south. So thank you for being with us here to talk about this theme. We talked about it a little bit more informally just before and what it brought to everybody's mind. So I have a first question, Moussa, regarding what Les Déterminés is. Well, with this association, Les Déterminés, we have two objectives. It's to allow everybody to find a job. And we do this in two ways, by allowing young people, and they're not so young, in the popular neighborhoods to create their own companies. And secondly, we work on a program of employability. So we go and speak with companies who are seeking to recruit people with different skills, and we try to train people and support them so that they can go for those jobs and enter within an economic ecosystem that they're not necessarily familiar with, and it does produce results. So we understand what this is. When we think about social anger spontaneously, I've been talking about it for the past few days. There are words that keep coming back: the yellow vests, the retirement reform, and also the carers, people working within the social care and healthcare system. And in past weeks, we've had a lot of people beginning to worry about these weeks of lockdown and what will happen with the social crisis which is appearing. And the President Macron today explained that when we go back to school in September, it will probably be very difficult. Are you worried? Yes, I'm very worried and even angry. First of all, I hope that the country shows its anger, because I think that it's not a sufficient driver for change, but it is one driver for change. And I think that one of the challenges today is to really move away from these feelings that are conjured up, because that brings us closer to populism. So we feel that we can't do anything with regard to injustice, and then the anger produces hope. But we mustn't keep it all boiling within ourselves. This hate against foreigners, against the elite. Populism is a driving force of hate, whereas if we're angry, it can be a driving force for change. Sometimes, when we look at the question today, we might think that we fear this anger. How can we alleviate it? It's because we're looking at that because we're frightened of it. But I think that, yes, the anger should be alleviated, but the first question is, why are people angry? Where is this anger coming from? And in order to alleviate it, we must answer the questions raised by this anger. I think that that's the very point of this debate. So, yes, Camille, a professor of economy. What is this anger today? What do we mean by social anger today? What are the factors that are behind this anger? Well, that's a good question. First of all, I must say that I was quite surprised to be invited to participate in this debate, because as an economist, social anger is not something that we work on at all. We are blind to conflict and its political dimension in most of our work. Yet, we must face up to one thing. We do work on the organization of institutions. So we are quite familiar with analyzing how certain institutions can act as mediators within a conflict. And I think that from that point of view, what's very interesting in France with regard to other countries, and what a lot of work and researchers have shown, is what Koch and Algen said, a society of defiance. And that is because of the highly vertical state power. We're unable to generate negotiation to alleviate micro conflicts and find solutions before it starts to cluster up and form an enormous ball of anger, which is far more difficult to manage. And we saw that with the yellow vests. Now, of course, if the question is, where is this anger coming from today? I think that there are many different dimensions, things that we don't agree upon. We want to be part of society, but we don't agree with things. Today, there is a lot which is related to a conflict around resources and distribution and increasing inequalities. That's very clear. We see this in France. We can see it extensively in other countries as well, in the United Kingdom and the United States. There is a conflict, a dimension of the conflict, which is strongly related to economic inequalities, status and access to resources. There are other feelings as well that we've seen. I'm not sure if we should name them social anger, but it's the Me Too movement. Can we put it in this category? Well, of course we can, yes. No, it seems to me that what we're trying to understand here is why at one point one category of the population says, well, I am not represented, or I do not have the status, or I do not have access to the social position that I should have access to. And I'm ready to engage in a conflict in order to achieve this. That's the Me Too movement. All of a sudden, people said, no, we're fed up. As women, we're badly treated. Nobody does anything to give us a voice. There's no specific political representation. Therefore, the only way of expressing and make ourselves heard is to create a movement in order to advance the feminist cause in public debate. Today, there's also the Black Lives Matter movement, which is very interesting because it is expressed very strongly in the Anglo-Saxon world as a movement in which there is a very clear part of the ethnic minorities that are not represented and which are clearly oppressed and obliged to find a method of political expression in order to make things change. So there's always a feeling of injustice which is behind this anger. Do you agree with this, Moussa CAMARA? Of course there is anger in the country. We see this on a daily basis. The problem is today, there are also things that work well in the difficult neighborhoods in particular, and which we don't put the spotlight on. And that tends to create this tension that exists in the country. I would like to say also here that we can see young people born into a country and they go to school like everybody else, but at the end, they don't have the same opportunities as others. So the question here is, how can we facilitate and improve living conditions of these millions of inhabitants who live in these neighborhoods? And I think when we go to the most difficult areas, if we can manage to find solutions that really change people's lives, I think then a lot of the tension will be alleviated. I'm not saying that nothing is right. There are certain things that are going very well and progress is being made. And it's thanks to the work of many people in France and engaged citizens that this is happening. But behind this tension, we must also talk about engagement, commitment. We all have our own responsibility. What do we want the society in which we live to look like? What do we want for the future? So the children and the future generations must have a better life, just as those who preceded us made sure that we would have better living conditions. So there are challenges. We talked about the environment, jobs, discrimination. And there we have to hit hard. We have to really commit. So the objective is to show what's happening and to think about how people like myself, there'll be more people like myself in the round tables and in all of the institutions where decisions are made, so that people understand the Republic is for everybody. So what you're saying is very interesting, Moussa. I would like to come back with you on the meaning behind these social movements. Do you have a similar view? There are injustices, and we can alleviate this anger if we reduce the injustice. I think above all that we're in a period that will accelerate these processes. I think that the experience of the past 3 months really means that we have a wish for radicality and transformation. That's both in the social sphere, private sphere. Some people will divorce, some will move house. There's a lot of desire of radicality. I think that's very strong, and that will speed up the trends. I think that it's social, but it's also Me Too. It's also the big events, such as the one for Floyd. So there is an archipelago of angers which have trouble becoming political movement. So often they're very local and disconnected from national level. So this is what strikes me, and I think that with the worsening of the economic crisis, it won't make things better. But also, people have expectations in terms of art of living and work. But there's a qualitative dimension in all of this: respect between men and women, respect between children whose parents were migrants. So this is the deep change which is underway. This is what I see with there is a generation gap which we haven't seen since 1968. And the cultural project between the young children, that profound feeling of equality, and the older people, that's also a major challenge. There's a tremendous gap there. So it's social in the very broad sense of the term, but it's more societal angers here. Some are directly related to employment, they're social. Others are related to scandalous discrimination. Others are related to changes in mindsets. And so gender equality is the same thing. I mean, and the ecology is a core question, because the virus, it's the first time that nature has destructured us through this virus. And this is an idea of what might be awaiting us in the future. So just one idea. This crisis has made us have another idea of society. We saw people working in social care and health care, and who continued to work. They're badly paid. They work in very difficult conditions, but we now give them our respect. Before we didn't have any. Then there's the world of production, industry, culture. There are people who produce something, and they stayed at home. And then there are people who work remotely. That's 50% of people in Paris, 60% executive, who create a new geography. So what you're saying, I think it resonates with Clémentine. AUTAIN, when we talk about the working world and the differences that have come to light over the past 3-4 months, that is a cause of anger. Yes, it's a cause of anger. So what I agree with Jean-Pierre is what has come out with this COVID crisis is the meaning of society, the meaning of going to work. We were faced with this question because we were brought back to basics, because society came to a halt. And no doubt there will be very deep-rooted political aspirations that stem from this this moment when time stopped. And so, and what is important, which came out of this crisis, is individual responsibility. That's what kept us going. It's the professionalism of carers who had no protective overalls, who have been through decades of austerity, where we've got rid of a number of beds. We had people who were faced with burnout, but their commitment, their professionalism meant that they kept going. Then there were all the people who got back to work, people responsible for deliveries, cashiers at the checkouts, and they were, meant that the society could keep going. But we've never seen that before. Nothing else could have achieved this. There was no political change that supported those that allowed us to keep going. What allowed us to keep going were not the choice of the government, who didn't even know how to produce enough masks, but it was everybody's individual investment. And we have parts of society who were not individualists, but they were had a desire for the commons. And they question themselves about the desire of going to work. This question of bullshit jobs, for example. And we didn't speak about this, but the question of ecology has really become imprinted in people's minds. And we've seen this in the municipal elections. Of course, we had to be very cautious because you make a direct link here. You think the results of the second round of the elections, municipal elections, might have been different if there was not this crisis? Difficult to say. Yes, well, I think that they suffered from this. Above all, the massive abstentions. That was quite striking, in particular in the difficult neighborhoods where the lack of people who went to vote was really great. So when we look at the curve of participation in the elections over the past 30 years, there's a very steep drop, and it's continuing. So we wonder how far this will go, in particular with regard to municipal elections, which normally are very favored by French citizens. So the question of ecology, what is essential is that it shouldn't appear to be a question for the well-off people in peri or urban areas. When we look at the ecological dysfunctions, here it is people in the underprivileged neighborhoods who feel more affected. So this comes back to what Jean VIARD and Camille comes to. The question of mediation is very important because the way in which anger is expressed, we see this with Me Too and the Yellow Vests, less on retirement, where it was more traditional. But if we look at the Yellow Vests or the climate movement, which is very strong, with the youth who are protesting in the streets and who feel really invested, but they're not connected to unions or trade unions or political parties as such. It is society as a whole that is uprising. And the problem is that there is no longer any mediation. And when we do this within the scope of mediation, and this has been going on for quite a long time, nothing happens. So when you're a big trade union and you do major demonstrations and you tell the government you can't reform retirement in this way, it doesn't work. So there is a responsibility on behalf of the state to no longer be here. Listen to this mediation, and it's because this mediation mechanism has been damaged for decades that anger occurs outside of that framework. But if on the left wing, in the underprivileged neighborhoods, we had met our promises. Since a specific movement against racism, maybe there would not be so much acrimony and defiance with regard to different populations, above all those that stem from immigration, with the traditionalist left-wing parties. What's happening is very serious, and that's why I insist on mediation. I think that it is one of the means in which we can alleviate anger. Well, alleviating anger, I'm absolutely for us alleviating anger. The idea is not to put out a fire, but it is to bring solutions. It is to understand the anger, to turn them into hope, and above all, into hope and concrete changes. And from that point of view, there is something that is starting to appear and which is becoming aligned with politics. Camille Landais. Yes, to react to what you're saying, I think that it's very important. I think that the crisis of mediation and social conflict that we are facing up to today, I think that there are three main components that it's very important to recall. The first, which is quite simple, it's that of representation. As we were saying, there is a bit of, well, we're not represented by the traditional political parties. There is no method by which we can make our voice heard in the public debate other than entering into conflict. And it's quite striking from that point of view. There is the work that we were talking about before, which was carried out in Sweden, where we see that there was a total disappearance of representation of the popular classes in the Social Democratic Party in Sweden over the past 20 years. So what happens? You have a new party that came to light. It's the extreme right-wing party, the Swedish Democrats, where there is a real representation of people from the popular classes. So we shouldn't be surprised. The conflict is becoming violent because people are saying there's nobody to make my voice heard, and that's the real challenge. And this is true for each time we have a particular conflict. For young people, for women, for minorities, the political parties must be able to carry this representation with people within the parties that come from these different origins. The second element, and this is something that Jean Viard said, which is extremely important. He says the new aspirations are societal aspirations. And what is fascinating is that today there is a real problem in the sense that beforehand we had political matrices that entirely integrated the economic and societal dimensions. It's Marxism, basically. It's a program for everything. It's a program for life, for economy, for everything. It's all encompassing. And all of a sudden, these big ideologies that integrated the economic and the social are disappearing. So how can I create a political ideology that allows me at once to say, well, yes, here I'm able to address the question of women or of the minorities and the question of social inequalities. I have no ideological matrix in order to think about these things altogether. So it creates a gap, an explosion of the representations. And instead of having the big parties, we have a whole lot of small little parties appearing. And the third point, which is important, is the question, which is a very French question, of having entirely eradicated all of the intermediate bodies over the past 30, 40 years. We're not the only ones to have done this, of course. Most of the big developed countries have problems with the unions. We traditionally have a problem with unions in France. But today, we're in a society of defiance where the state must and can, or they think they can do everything, and therefore they are not giving any responsibilities to the intermediate bodies to manage the conflict. And this necessarily creates this major problem of mediation of the social conflict. And if we don't solve these three aspects all at once, I don't see how we can effectively alleviate this anger. So Camille Landais just said that there are a lot of people have the impression that there are no bodies or people to make their voices heard. That was no doubt a cause of the anger that was expressed. Do you feel that in the difficult neighborhoods, people have the feeling that they have nobody to make their voices heard, who represent them and who could carry forth their claims, their expectations, their hopes?
It's not that people do not feel represented. It's just that they're represented, but these representations that we have are not in the highlights. Earlier on, Mrs. AUTAIN talked about the marching for equality in 1983, the Marche des Beurs. But once the leaders are politicized, the movement dies. But when they're not political, there's no support. Very often what happens is that people disengage from the political field. Today, there's other solutions thanks to the internet, social networks, etc., social platforms, etc. You no longer need a political movement or unions to call people for a general mobilization. People get organized. And this is very interesting because at some point in some districts, some political decisions were not up to standard, and this created some tensions. But wherever I go in the various districts or areas, yesterday I was in Montpellier, I went to some areas, there's an interesting and positive dynamic, a positive movement. People commit and do beautiful things, but unfortunately they have very little means and they're not in the spotlight. And at one point they just get tired and disengaged. And when everybody loses commitment, well, this leads to a problem. The strength, the power of commitment is huge, and it is what can lead to changes. The changes will not necessarily come from the politicians, but also from the citizens who can get organized and make proposals that will improve everybody's standard of living and living conditions. And I see that everywhere in the districts and in the various neighborhoods. And we saw that during the crisis when people felt a lot of solidarity, were taking care of their neighbors, were organizing some actions and movements because they felt it was important to show that solidarity. If we've been able to show this solidarity over 3 months, I believe we should continue with that and encourage it. We can do it. And people get organized without necessarily waiting for a structure. And this is what we did with Les Déterminés. Well, you were talking about being disengaged. There's someone who's following the discussion who is talking about immense social fatigue. And don't you think this is what is happening, that we have a huge lack of commitment or a huge disengagement? Well, no, I disagree. There's a lot of things happening over the past few years. I feel there's a renewal, an increase in social mobilization and political conflicts. I have that feeling. I'm not saying that after 3 months of COVID, there's not a huge fatigue, but we'll see that in September, and we'll see if, if there's no second wave of COVID, we'll see whether we'll see huge demonstrations. I agree that we need citizens' initiatives, and this is the first step that is of uppermost importance. For example, for the environment, those who start by changing their own daily practice, for example, use their bicycles more often, or those who became more conscious and more aware of things and more political. But at one point, you fight and then you hit the wall. I agree. Well, I come from Seine-Saint-Denis, so I know exactly. Well, you have to know that in Seine-Saint-Denis, this is the area of France where you have more companies being created. So people have a lot of energy. The problem being that if you have no money to support the project, you send your personal history, you send it, and people see that you're either black or of Arab origin. They send you back a letter saying, okay, thank you, but no. It means that people, after a while, they have a lot of energy. I'm impressed by the energy of this territory where I am. But this is when people hit the wall and suddenly become political, and this is when you reach macroeconomics, when you have a capitalism that is more and more financial, and you see more and more of the wealth that is ending up in the pockets of the shareholders, while you have less and less money for the common good and to support the fabric of SMEs. I think it's a very good thing that people should do things with their neighbors, but I also see the limits of this if there's no structural change, strong structural change. Obviously, there is the issue of sharing the wealth, which is at the very heart of my political family. But there's also something else. You shouldn't just wonder about how you can share what you have produced, but you should also think about what you produce. And I think Camille was talking about the ideological corpuses. I'm not making a dichotomy, a difference between social and societal. I think both are linked. Using the social element is a way of, or societal issue is a way of setting aside the racism and all these other issues. I can tell you that if I can tell you to the school where my children go, you'll see what the society really is, and you'll see that everything is social, and the political project should embrace all these various issues to give a convergence to these emancipating discussions. Camille, you're a professor of economics. We can see this discussion, this issue of economics is obviously an issue. Is it at the very root of social anger? We saw the price of fuel being at the very core of issues in 2018. There's always a small triggering point that comes from resources, really, or income. Yes, obviously, because you need resources if you want to live. So if you want to be able to live and flourish. But what Clémentine was saying is very clear. What we need is to introduce a framework of social and political framework because the private initiative issue is an issue. There's a point in the neighborhoods where if you do not set up the right political framework to enable people to lead their projects to fruition, then you end up with fatigue and anger. Let me give you an example. If you talk about equality of chances, if I take the example of the US, because I know that the data well, if you look at the probability, if you divide the population into 5 groups based on their resources, let's take a child from an ethnic minority, for example, an Afro-American, whose parents came, ended up in at the very top scale there. What is the probability for their child to stay in this top group of income? Well, it's only 20%. They have as many chances of falling back into this at the very bottom than the others, which means that despite all their efforts, there is a system, a real economic and social system that prevents them from realizing their potential, developing their potential. If you take people in the U.S. who are in the top group of revenues and who are Caucasian, this is about 70% of chances to stay in that group of income for their children. So at one point you cannot but wonder what is wrong in the political rules and what should be changed. And if you don't do anything about that, you create anger and disillusions. And this is very important. And this is why there's so many private initiatives. Jean Viard, we were talking about all these movements born on social platforms. This is communication tools. You were taking the example of 68 and the level of angers. The forms of anger have changed a lot. Yes, obviously the digital networks have played an important role in the yellow vest movement, but things have changed as well. In 68, the workers used to live next to their working place. While the yellow vest didn't work where they lived, it's a population from the city that left the city to live in rural areas. They were people that very often left the social housing, managed to buy a small house in an estate, and at one point people told them, "Well, your house is not properly insulated. Your car is diesel car. You're not in the right on the right track." These people had fought, and they were being pulled down. But we will not go back to the political life that we used to know. Our family tribes are at the very core of our solidarity, even though they're not legal sometimes because 60% are not married. We spend 4 hours a day on the digital tools, and then you have the separation of the place you live and the place you work. On average, we cover 50 kilometers a day. So you have obviously quite a lot of local possibilities at local level, schools, agriculture, etc. But this is disconnected from the companies. You live far from the place you work. And this is a regulatory issue. The political world we've known until now is in the past. I remember it's a society of archipelagos. I talked about that a while ago. And there's the issue of but there's private happiness and public happiness. 70% of people are happy in their neighborhood with their friends, in their family, but they're in despair when they look at the world. So we are closeted in our houses. During the COVID crisis, we protected ourselves. We saved 100 million lives. But in a way, we sort of closeted ourselves in our houses. When you think that 5 billion men or humankind were looking at the whole world and seeing how they were wearing masks, paying taxes, but everybody was looking at everybody, and at the same time we were restoring the borders. So we can talk about neighborhood solidarity. We say we consumed less and we were more citizens. We stayed at home because we were citizens. Young people were incredible. The young people in the neighborhoods, they didn't have much risk, but it was rather quieter than in the past. So let's try and keep this strength that was developed, and let's not renew with the past political debates. I don't think we'll go back to that, but let's see how we can have a more humanistic society, a more social society. There's a small detail which I think is great, is the passion of people for second-hand things. When you are wearing something which is second-hand, it's more ecological. It's a good thing to do. While 20 years ago, if you wore second-hand clothes, it was a sign of poverty. So I think there's quite a lot of cultural changes, and this is why the COVID crisis has given us some tools. Clémentine AUTAIN wants to react.
Yes, you don't agree with everything. No. And let us check what we disagree upon. Let us check. I'm absolutely convinced that politics can no longer adopt the same forms as in the 20th century with the big parties that structured everything and that were organized around companies. Often there was trade unionism and politics at the same time, and with mass parties which are very homogenous and very vertical. I think that's behind us now, but it's not because that political form is behind us that politics is behind us. I don't believe that at all, but really not at all. And this time that we're crossing now, this time of solidarity, citizenship, the responses that are both individual and collective, will lead to politics. And it will not take place in yesterday's forms. Those who think that because the yesterday's forms will no longer exist, there will no longer be politics, that means that it's the end of its game end, but that's not the case. So politics are not just political parties that are up for election. Politics in the broad sense is cultural stakes, but politics that happen during the elections. And when I talk about Macron, a government that takes this measure or that measure, for the past 30 years, one after the other, the different governments are absolutely the same. And in order to lead change, which is a collective change, we need politics and a change in government. So in the neighborhoods that you're familiar with, are people aware that politics can change the game? Or Clémentine is familiar with these neighborhoods as well? Or do people just no longer believe in politics as a means of improving our lives? Well, it depends what politics we're talking about. Today, there are many young people, and the not so young, who are starting to commit locally. We saw this in the municipal elections, where people understood that when they were organized, when there were enough of them, they can impose their ideas. And I see this in my city in Cergy. We made a lot of progress in that direction because people committed and started to take an interest in everything that was happening, not necessarily politics, but the life of in their neighborhood. And they saw that regarding the numbers, I remember when I started, it was about 13 years ago, when I started in working with the associations, we were making our claims. We wanted sports equipment. We wanted to have access to what was available in our town. And even that we were not allowed. And when we started a civic movement, we called upon all of the neighborhoods of Cergy, and we all went and signed up for the electoral lists. And there were 600 or 700 young people signing up to vote. And that changed things immediately. And we saw that we carried weight and that could change our relationship and the power struggle with the politicians. So we took an interest in everything that was taking place around us. And that's what led us to undertake this action. But in most neighborhoods, they just don't care about the political states because nobody ever takes them into account. All of the people campaigning in these underprivileged neighborhoods, people say, well, we don't believe you. You just say whatever you think we want to hear, and then you forget about it once you're elected. So I confirm you, of course. So there is this hope in politics. It's because there is such a gap. There are so many promises that have not been held. I think that a politician must be in the field, at the grassroots. They must listen to the people. They can't do everything, but they must try and make sure that they understand, they've listened, they've understand, in order to make people want to be involved in politics. And then there's the social problems for people. When you're young and you can't manage to pay your rent and it's difficult to find a job, why would you take an interest in politics? Your vital needs are not met. You have to find a job. You have to pay your rent. You have to guarantee more or less normal living conditions before you can take an interest in what's happening around you. And until we solve those problems, we won't achieve anything. That's why our association really works on the core of the problem, on employment, because we know that when people work, they can dream. They're free to travel, to buy, to have a better life, to give a better life to their children, and then they can take an interest in what's happening around them at the end of their own street. But when you're in a difficult situation, if people come and say, well, vote, you won't even go there. And so we need to help people. That's why there's a real challenge around that. I don't know if among those who are managing the country today, people realize just how harsh the social situation is. I really wonder about that. If there's a real gap, I wonder. It's what Camille was saying as well. Yes, and this is what we hear. If politicians realized what the situation was actually like, how vulnerable people were, how poor people were, maybe they would understand the decisions, because it's impossible to allow a small bunch of people live a life of luxury and the masses living a life of deprivation. So we have the impression that everybody who is a decision maker live in a bubble that's very, very distant from real life. In 2005, regarding the mediations that don't work, what happened in 2005 was tremendous as well. And people hadn't done it with the proper form, of course, because they burnt cars and public buildings. So, and people say, well, when you're angry, you mustn't do that. But if we don't understand that that's where they are because the mediation has failed and they don't have any other way of expressing their anger, if we don't hear them, if we don't listen to them, I don't think that we will find the solution and alleviate this anger. Jean-Pierre, is there a bigger disconnection today between politics and reality? Are the politics no longer aligned? Are they no longer synchronized with the population and people, or has it always been like that? So to come back to what Clémentine Vanna was saying, I don't think it's the end of politics, but I think the form has changed because first of all, there was religion, then major ideologies. So when I was young, the problem of finding a job, we immediately thought was a political question, because it is, of course, a profoundly political question. But today it's disconnected because society has shifted speed. And the gap between political systems, the culture, and people's life is amazing, and I agree with that. But it's because there's a digital revolution. It's the fact that we're engaged in a world where 80% of women work. And so society is changing so fast that the politics can't keep up. But in a country where there are taxes, people can be taxed up to 50%, then it's not a country without redistribution. There's a tremendous amount of redistribution, but it's not enough. And it's not a question of volume. It's a question of how people are involved and how, rather than just so we have to allow people to be free to act and give them a good education. That's what they want. It's the freedom to do, and that we give them the means necessary to speed things up. Then there has to have to be social protection schemes. So it's difficult to talk about it, but we are in a moment which is extremely dangerous. When we see major previous crises, the 1914, 1918, we had the confrontation between Hitler and Stalin. So we shouldn't be surprised that most of these are drawn by authoritarian parties. We are breaking with the democratic model. And we must manage gigantic social upturns. And we need to find the keys. So sometimes, and the last thing, fundamentally, there is a crisis in the future. But where I draw a bit of hope from this COVID-19, for a long time, we thought we could change the world thanks to artists, etc. So we know that the communist model doesn't work. So how can we have a common project for the future? And what I believe is that thanks to this crisis, we realize that if we all pull together, first of all, we saved hundreds of thousands of human lives, and we can do it because we create a group to fight. And we can come together to fight against global warming. So, of course, people know how to sort their waste, so they go from diesel cars to bicycles, but nobody really thought it would radically change the question. But here, maybe we have a turning point for the future, because it's a trust in our capacity to fight against global warming. And if we do this, then people will say, well, some people want to help companies, others want a decline of growth, but we must, if we're able to come back to this, we will have hope for the future. And when we have a future, we always find the way. If you just join us, we're live from the Maison de la Radio in Paris, and we're holding a duplex in the south of France with Jean-Pierre, and we're debating around the question of alleviating social anger with a Member of Parliament, Clémentine and Moussa, who's the founder of the association, and the Camille Landais and Jean Lia. We have about 15 minutes left for discussions, and I will turn to Camille, to the questions. There are questions, one which is in particular very interesting, that of Brian Ferravero, who is asking, how can we apprehend this anger in the era of digital technology? Can companies such as the GAFA, Facebook, Twitter, etc., the leaders of the internet, do these GAFA have a role to play in this increasing anger and their alleviation?
Do you have an opinion, Camille? Yes, I have a lot to say, says Camille. There's lots to say about the role of these platforms. Are they instrumental in raising the anger? Well, I would say that the economists have fought it over a lot over the past few years, wondering whether the disinformation on these platforms was real and had a political impact. Overall, what people see is that there is a lot of disinformation on these networks. And obviously, this affects the way in which people see the problems and view the problems. If you do an exercise, for example, randomizing access to information to people on Facebook, they tend to believe what they're told on Facebook. Now, the other thing that is interesting is that it doesn't seem that the access to these various types of contents impacts really a lot their political action. Meaning that, in fact, you don't have to move many people in terms of political action to overturn an election, for example, in the U.S. So there may not be 50% migrants in the U.S. People might tell you that it's really 10%, but nevertheless, people voted for Trump. Now, if conversely, you manage to switch these few electors that will shift the election in some states like Wisconsin or others, this might have an impact. So disinformation does have an impact on political imbalances. We don't know how much impact it has, but I think it cannot be considered as negligible. Now, the editorial responsibility of this platform is there. No one can say that they are not editorial platforms because they do gain access to a very wide public. And in the past, this type of expression was always controlled to make sure that there was a certain level of editorial quality. This is the story of journalism. The fact that these media can completely bypass and shunt the rules that apply to the rest of information tools is is obvious, and this is why a lot of people who want to use this information use these platforms. And this has given a monstrous power to these platforms. Facebook is living 70% from the advertising on these platforms, and there's a lot of people exchanging this disinformation. So if you talk about the power of the GAFAs and their preying behavior, this is something that is absurd. We're trying to move and change things. It's very difficult to do, but I believe there is a consensus that one should act and act quickly. Moussa, the role of social networks in the rising of anger, is it a good thing? Is it good that they should be able to express their anger in a dematerialized and digital way? Is it a good thing or is it not good? And is it a sterile discussion? How do you envisage things? Is it an opportunity and an idea, a discussion of well, I believe it's difficult because it does both things. It frees the word of each and everyone to say things that are completely absurd, but it also helps us mobilize in some areas. And we've seen that there are some petitions that have been started on social networks and that ended up being seized by the political authorities because they had seen the movement. Now, I'm not going to go into this question of the GAFAs or not, but it's a different form of mobilization, and even within committed associations, we know that this is an incredible way of acting. Thanks to social networks. Sometimes they are more important than the media, than the social media, than the traditional media. And now, obviously, we have to find the right balance to make sure that people express themselves while respecting each other. But it's a great opportunity for me. Clémentine, as an elected member of the Republic, do you think it's good? Well, it's a tool for mobilization and communication, in particular if you are part of a movement that is not in the general dominant wave of power. But what is complicated is the growing desynchronization of access to information. It can either closet people in a bubble, or there you live with your friends on Facebook or Twitter, and you end up creating a closed world, and the part of sharing information is no longer there. In the past, we all watched the 8 o'clock news, and then the next day we all had the same information, same news. But it always takes you where you've been. It doesn't take you where you haven't been. It's crazy. It gets on my nerves sometimes. It's unbearable. Second thing, as was said, the place of finance and advertising in this story is huge. And let me say as well that information about our private life, I know that people don't pay attention to that, but it is a serious issue, a very serious issue. The fact that data are recorded. I recommend you to read the last book from Damasio called Les Furtifs, where you're projected into the next decade. I think you're going to frighten us. Yes, it seems that it's far away, but it's tomorrow, huh? And it's really frightening. Someone who is walking down the street and trying to avoid the sensors, and because you have a lot of sensors when you walk, and he ends up, he finishes on a sensor, and what happens? The sensor takes his shoe and the shape of his foot, and 3 meters later, he finds his shoe, his name, and the brand of, the Nike of the moment, adapted to the little problem he has in his feet. And this is very frightening when you really... So the recording of data, the use of data for merchant uses, for example, in the future, the city of Orange is bought up by Orange, the Orange company, and you wonder where the merchandisation of your city, of your life, is going to end up. And if this is being captured by private companies, if it were public companies, I would be also worried. But I believe that the issue of freedom is not really in the public debate. If freedom is just a freedom of consuming and creating companies, it's not enough. We have to talk about real freedom. Law has a more economic question, she says. We need about 6 generations to get out of poverty. The average salary has been stagnated for the past 10 years. One household out of 2 is not viable. How can we make sure that things become more fair? Is there a miracle solution? Because she feels that anger is generated by a problem of resources. Well, we have 4 minutes to talk about that. Well, obviously, there is a complete change in the structure of inequalities. This change has taken place over the past 20 years and represents a huge problem of reorganization of our economic and social system. There are a lot of paths to be explored. I believe that social anger can really find its way through and find solutions for new models in the work of many sociologists or others. The issues are always more or less the same. How can we make sure that everybody can participate in a fair way to the issue of resource distribution? So distribution of resources, co-management of companies, fiscal policies for redistribution. And if I may come back to this issue, law says one French person out of two is taxable. It's not true. Everybody pays a lot of taxes, including this famous VAT, CSG, whatever. So we all share in national solidarity, and there's a high level of compulsory taxes, but it goes at a par with a demand for a redistribution that is not working always very well. And the issue is to see how we can adjust it. And there's a lot of possibilities, and but this will be for the next discussion. Yes, we have less than 4 minutes left. Jean-Pierre, social anger is a good thing, no? Is it what gets society to move? Well, a society, says Jean-Pierre, is something that has to live. Otherwise, it's a disaster. Social problems, we have to get the importance, the impression that our lives are moving on. If you just have social anger and no impression that you're moving on, then this leads to frustration and totalitarianism. So don't be mistaken, but I believe we have shifted towards digital civilization. If you think it's only dates back to 2007, we thought were at the time we just learned to use the digital platforms, but now it's part of our life for everyone, parents, grandparents, wage earners, everybody. And we've seen cars and the majors of oil major companies reorganize the world in the past. Well, now it's different, but things is being reorganized. And the borders, people who are talking languages, people tell you about what they heard on a program on the U.S. just as if it was the same culture, but it's not. Let me conclude by saying what we used to call modernity may be at the end. The fact that the farmers wanted a big tractor, they wanted a big house and everything. Now you need to ally tradition and technological progress. Everything that is modern is no longer good. People are interested in how they can live with quality and with technical progress. There's the spirit of the place that is being replaced in modernity. And this is the link between the digital world and the spirit of the place. Thank you, Jean-Pierre. Moussa, one word about the hope that these social angers can lead to. Do you think the world can change through this expression of anger? I think we have to be very optimistic and positive. People always say that things are not going well today, but they'll be better tomorrow. And I believe for the younger generations, we have to be optimistic. Many things are progressing, are advancing. There's a lot of positive aspects that weren't there in the past. There's a lot of solidarity which just has to be supported so that each and every one of us can commit. And the more you commit, the more everyone commits at a different level, the more appeased and alleviated the society. But it has to go through commitment, employment, all the initiatives that are ongoing if we want to alleviate and appease our society. And okay, let's keep committed. Camille, LANDAIS, optimistic? Well, I'm a great optimist. But I like to commit, and I feel it's a challenge. The will to get things moving, the desire to participate, It's like Sisyphus in a way, but I'm rather optimistic. I see a lot of new expressions, new political fights that are very pleasing to me. But there's a lot of clouds on the horizon. Let's not be deluded. We are a cooperative species in a way. If we use this for good, we should make it. Clémentine, are you optimistic? Well, I have the optimism of will and pessimism of intelligence. Well, maybe we have this idea that something appeared at the time of COVID, but that had pre-existed with the demonstrations for climate change, the Me Too wave, the yellow vest, etc. So this seems to be showing a way, then we can use it to find the right way for the 21st century. Let's say we have to make a difference between more and better. If you look at the 30 in the past years, we felt that if we consumed more and had more than the neighbor, we would be happy. And now we realize that having more and accumulating is not only a disaster for the planet, but also for our lives and liberty. It's not really what is most interesting. So I feel that this basic rupture of the link between more and better can lead us to design a better future. But one of the conditions would be to include the working classes in this. And we have the feeling that the extreme right is advancing in our country, and and a lot of people are in a bubble that is that doesn't want to know about what's happening in the working classes, and we won't get out of it if we do not see a strength and a power that takes this into account for the future. Well, thank you all for taking part in this exchange. That I hope shed light on these reflections. Thank you, Camille, Jean VIARD, Moussa, CAMARA, Camille, LANDAIS. Thank you all. Clémentine AUTAIN, thank you for continuing to listen to Aix-en-Seine for the Rencontre des économistes. Thank you all.